In the valley where Jerusalem burned its garbage and ancient kings sacrificed children, one man walked to his death carrying 30 pieces of silver. The coins were heavy, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. The price of a dead slave, the cost of innocent blood. This is what happened in the hours after Judas betrayed Jesus, told through the coins he carried, the cliffs he climbed, and the clay beneath his feet. Stay until the end, because understanding the physical geography of this tragedy transforms how we see the cold machinery of guilt, purity, and disposal in the world Jesus lived in. 30 pieces of silver was not a random payment. It was a calculated insult, rooted in the legal codes of the Torah and the economic realities of first century Judea. The coins themselves were Tyrian shekels. These were the standard currency of the temple, required for the annual temple tax and used in all transactions within the sacred courts. They were minted in Tyre and carried a silver purity of roughly 94%, far higher than the debased Roman denarius, which by the reign of Tiberius had dropped to approximately 80% silver. This purity mattered. The money changers whom Jesus overturned in the outer courts existed precisely to exchange common Roman and Greek currency into the sanctioned shekels. The temple would accept nothing less. Each Tyrian shekel was worth 4 Roman denarii. A denarius was the standard daily wage for a hired laborer in the vineyards or a skilled craftsman on a building site. 30 shekels then represented 120 days of continuous work, 4 months of dawn to dusk labor. In modern terms, depending on how one calculates ancient wages, this sum has been estimated at between $5,000 and $12,000. It was real money, enough to buy land, enough to live on for half a year. But the specific amount carried a deeper meaning. In the book of Exodus, the law of Moses declared that if an ox gored a slave to death, the owner of the ox must pay the slave's master 30 shekels of silver as restitution. It was the legal price of the lowest form of human property in the social hierarchy, not a free man, not a citizen, a slave. By offering Judas exactly 30 pieces, the chief priests were making a statement. They were not buying the capture of a prophet or a political revolutionary. They were purchasing a piece of damaged goods. The amount was contempt made currency, and Judas accepted it. When Judas realized that Jesus had been condemned to death, something inside him collapsed. The Greek verb used in Matthew's account is metamelomai, a word that means regret, remorse, the sickening recognition of a mistake. It was not metanoia, the transformative repentance that leads to restoration. It was the pain of knowing what he had done, without any vision of how to undo it. He went back to the temple. He carried the 30 shekels with him, still in whatever pouch or cloth he had used to transport them from Gethsemane. He entered the court of the women, where the 13 bronze trumpet-shaped receptacles of the treasury stood against the eastern wall. This was the korban, the sacred fund that financed the daily sacrifices, the incense, the maintenance of the sanctuary itself. Judas found the chief priests. He threw the silver down in front of them. The sound of 30 heavy coins striking the stone pavement or clattering into the bronze funnels would have been sharp, public, unmistakable. It was a confession without words, a desperate attempt to reverse the transaction, to return the price and dissolve the contract signed with a kiss. But the priests refused to take it back. Their reasoning was precise and coldly legal. The money, they said, was blood money, the price paid for a life. Under the purity laws rooted in Deuteronomy, such funds could not be placed back into the temple treasury. The same coffers that had paid out the silver hours earlier now classified it as ritually defiled. too tainted to touch the sacred economy of sacrifice and incense. The hypocrisy was absolute. The priests had been comfortable using temple funds to commission a betrayal, to pay for the arrest of a man they considered a threat. But once the money returned, once it had passed through the hands of a traitor and been marked by the condemnation of innocent blood, it became untouchable. The transaction was irreversible, and Judas was dismissed. The Greek word used to describe Judas's reaction, metamelomai, reveals everything about the psychology of his final hours. It was not repentance, it was regret. Metanoia, the word used elsewhere in the New Testament for true repentance, implied a transformative change of mind and heart. It was a turning, a 180-degree pivot toward restoration and grace. Metamelomai, by contrast, carried the sense of remorse, the crushing pain of realizing a mistake, the emotional weight of consequences fully understood. It was regret of the head, not the heart. Judas felt the full horror of what he had done. He confessed it aloud to the chief priests. He declared Jesus innocent. He attempted restitution by returning the silver, but none of these actions constituted repentance in the transformative sense. They were the frantic gestures of a man trying to undo a contract that could not be undone. In the honor-shame culture of first-century Judea, Judas faced a total collapse of identity. He had betrayed innocent blood. The priests had dismissed him. The silver lay on the temple floor, rejected. There was no legal mechanism to reverse his actions, no social pathway back into community, no ritual purification that could cleanse the stain of what he had carried into Gethsemane. The honor-shame framework was not individual, but collective. A man's worth was determined by his standing in the eyes of his community, his family, his lineage. Judas had obliterated that standing. He had become the traitor, the one who kissed the teacher and handed him to the Romans. In a world where identity was relational, he had severed every relationship that mattered. And so he walked out of the temple, still carrying the weight, not of the silver, but of a mistake that could never be repaid. The chief priests now stood in the court of the women with 30 pieces of silver on the stone floor and a legal problem in their hands. They could not return the money to the temple treasury. They had declared it blood money, tainted by its association with death and betrayal. The same purity laws that governed what animals could be sacrificed, what hands could touch the altar, what funds could finance the daily incense, these same laws now classified the returned silver as ritually defiled, but they also could not simply keep it. The coins had been paid from the Korban, the sacred treasury, and their return created a legal paradox. The transaction was complete, the arrest had been made. The prisoner had been condemned, but the payment itself had been rejected by the one who received it, thrown back into the sanctuary as an unwanted confession. The priests met in the chamber of the hewn stone, the Lishkat Hagazit, on the north side of the priest's court. This was where the great Sanhedrin convened, where legal rulings were finalized, where the machinery of temple law turned questions into binding decisions. They found a solution that was both charitable and expedient. They would use the blood money to purchase a field outside the city walls, not farmland, not residential property, a cemetery for strangers, foreigners who died in Jerusalem without family, without land, without the right to be buried among the covenant people. It was a legal loophole executed with precision. The money would be spent on a public work, technically charitable, benefiting the marginalized and the unclean. It would leave the temple's hands entirely, converted into land that would never generate income, never return to the sacred economy. And the field itself would be located in a place already associated with defilement, industry, and the city's refuse, the Hinnom Valley, where the potters dug their clay and Jerusalem burned its garbage. The The purchase solved the contamination problem by relocating it entirely outside the sacred geography of the city into the valley that had been cursed for centuries. The field the chief priest purchased was not farmland. It was not pasture. It was a depleted clay quarry on the southern slope of the Hinnom Valley, a plot of ground that had already given up everything of value. In first century Jerusalem, pottery was the largest manufacturing industry. Every household in the city, from the wealthiest estates on the upper city ridge to the poorest single-room dwellings in the lower city, required ceramic vessels, jars for storing water and wine, bowls for preparing and serving food, oil lamps to push back darkness after sunset. The demand was constant, and the potters worked without pause to meet it. The workshops were located at the edges of the city, typically in the valleys below the walls. This was deliberate. The kilns burned at temperatures approaching 800 degrees Celsius for 2 to 3 days at a time, and the risk of fire spreading into the crowded residential quarters was too great. The smoke, thick and acrid, needed to drift away from the inhabited streets. So the potters built their shops where the clay was close and the wind carried the fumes down slope. The Hinnom Valley provided both requirements. The lower slopes held deposits of moser marl, a workable clay that could be extracted, washed in rock settling pools, and tread underfoot to remove air bubbles. The potter then shaped the vessel on a kick wheel, a heavy stone flywheel set in a pit, spun by the potter's foot, while both hands remained free to pull and form the clay. It was physical work, repetitive, dusty. The potter's hands were stained, his lungs filled with silica, his back bent from hours over the wheel. Not every vessel survived the firing. Cracks appeared. Warping occurred. These failures, called wasters, were useless for sale and were discarded in massive heaps outside the workshop. The mounds of broken pottery grew so large and so permanent that they gave the Potsherd Gate, one of Jerusalem's southern entrances, its name. When a section of land had been mined for clay until the deposits were exhausted, it became marginal. The surface was pitted and uneven. The soil was too disturbed for cultivation. It was cheap, worthless for anything except disposal. This was the potter's field, not named because a potter owned it, but because the potters had already taken everything it had to offer. The chief priests bought it with the blood money, converted the tainted silver into depleted earth, and designated it as a burial ground for foreigners, those who died in Jerusalem without claim to the tombs of their ancestors. The field was located in the one place in the city where the industrial, the default and the cursed had already converged for centuries. The Hinnom Valley was not neutral ground. It was the most accursed location in the collective memory of Jerusalem. In the centuries before the time of Jesus, the valley had served as a site of abomination. During the reigns of the kings Ahaz and Manasseh, Israelites had built altars to the god Molech in the valley's southern reaches, burning their own children as offerings in rituals condemned by every prophet who spoke against them. The prophet Jeremiah had stood at the Potsherd Gate, holding a clay jar in his hands, and smashed it on the stones as a visible prophecy. Because of these abominations, he declared, the valley would be filled with corpses. It would be called the Valley of Slaughter. By the 1st century, the fires still burned, not for sacrifice, but for disposal. The Hinnom Valley had become Jerusalem's municipal refuse dump. Garbage was hauled down the slopes and thrown into the ravine. The carcasses of animals deemed unclean, the bodies of executed criminals considered unworthy of burial, the waste of the city's markets and households, all of it ended up in Gehenna. Fires were kept burning continuously to consume the accumulation, and the smoke rose day and night, visible from the temple courts above. It was this landscape, ash, smoke, broken pottery, and bones, that Jesus used as a metaphor for judgment, the unquenchable fire, the place where the worm does not die. Gehenna was not an abstract theological concept. It was a real location, and every person in Jerusalem knew exactly what it looked like. The potter's field was purchased on the slopes of this valley. The field where Judas would die was surrounded by the smoke of burning refuse, the shattered remnants of the pottery industry, and the memory of centuries of slaughter. It was the place where the city disposed of what it could not redeem. Judas hanged himself somewhere on the steep limestone cliffs that overlook the Hinnom Valley. The accounts in Matthew and Acts describe the same death from different angles. Matthew records that he hanged himself. Acts states that he fell headlong and his body burst open, spilling his intestines onto the ground. These are not contradictions. They are stages of the same event, separated by time and decomposition. The topography of the valley made the sequence inevitable. The southern slope is characterized by jagged limestone outcrops, sheer drops, and narrow ledges where scrub trees cling to cracks in the rock. Judas likely used one of these trees overhanging a cliff face to suspend himself above the ravine below. In the dry heat of a Jerusalem spring, a corpse begins to decompose rapidly. The abdomen bloats with gas. The tissues soften. The body becomes distended and fragile within hours. If the rope snapped, if the branch broke, if someone cut the body down, the fall onto the rocks below would have been catastrophic. A bloated abdomen striking jagged limestone ruptures on impact. The internal organs spill out. The scene is exactly as Acts describes it. Violent, grotesque, irreversible. The field earned its second name from this moment. Matthew attributes the name to a field of blood, to the blood money used to purchase it. Acts attributes it to the actual blood of Judas soaking into the depleted clay. Both were true. The field was marked twice, once by the silver, once by the body. For the family of Judas Iscariot, the consequences of his betrayal and death extended far beyond the cliffs of the Hinnom Valley. In first century Judea, honor and shame were not individual possessions, they were collective. A man's actions reflected on his household, his extended family, his lineage. The betrayal of a teacher, the suicide of a traitor, the association with blood money. These were stains that could not be washed away by time or distance. They marked everyone who shared the family name. The social penalties were immediate and absolute. Under Jewish law governing dishonorable deaths, the family of Judas would be denied the right to observe traditional mourning rites. No 7 days of intense grief. No 30 days of gradual return to normal life. The community expected them to publicly agree with the condemnation of the deceased, to show no sorrow, to speak no words of honor over the body. The burial itself would take place in the potter's field, among foreigners and strangers, in the valley where the smoke of refuse fires drifted across the graves. Judas could not be laid in the family tomb, could not rest among the bones of his ancestors. This was the ultimate exile in a culture where identity extended beyond death into the collected remains of generations. The legal status of the family's property became uncertain. Under Roman law, which influenced local practice, a traitor's assets could be confiscated or declared forfeit. Any inheritance Judas might have left would be tainted by association, rejected by the community, possibly seized by authorities who viewed betrayal as a crime against public order. The children, if there were any, would carry the stigma into adulthood. The wife, if there was one, would face suspicion and isolation. The extended family would distance themselves, erasing the connection, treating the household as if it had never existed within the lineage. In a world where survival depended on kinship networks, trade partnerships, and social standing within the village or neighborhood, this erasure was catastrophic. The family of Judas Iscariot was buried alongside him in the valley of ash and broken clay, their names forgotten, their grief unspoken. their existence reduced to silence in the collective memory of a community that had no category for forgiveness of this magnitude. The field of blood did not vanish after the 1st century. It remained embedded in the landscape and the memory of Jerusalem, accumulating layers of history as profound as the ash in the valley below. By the Byzantine era, the site had been filled with rock-cut tombs. Christian hermits lived in the caves, carving cells into the soft limestone, seeking solitude in the same ground where Judas had met his end. The valley that had once consumed garbage now housed monks who fasted and prayed in the dim light of oil lamps, their presence a strange inversion of the field's original purpose. During the Crusades, the Latin kings of Jerusalem constructed a massive underground charnel vault at Akeldama. This vault was used to store the remains of pilgrims and patients who died in the Crusader hospitals. The bodies were laid in the cool darkness beneath the earth, stacked in niches carved into the walls, their bones eventually mingling with the clay that potters had once extracted for their wheels. A belief emerged in medieval Europe that the soil of the potter's field possessed unusual properties. It was said that the earth of Akeldama could consume a human corpse in a single day. Whether this was attributed to divine curse or miraculous blessing depended on the theologian, but the practical result was the same. Merchants began shipping the earth in wooden casks to European cities, most notably Pisa, where it was sprinkled over local cemeteries to hasten decomposition. The cursed ground of Gehenna became a commodity, exported across the Mediterranean, its reputation for rapid dissolution transforming it into a tool for burial efficiency. Modern archaeology has turned its tools on the Hinnom Valley, and what has emerged from the earth is a portrait of accumulation, layer upon layer of use, abuse, and reinterpretation of the same cursed ground. In 1979, archaeologists working near Akeldama uncovered the Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls. These tiny rolled fragments of silver dating to the 7th century BC contained the oldest known quotations of biblical text, the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers, etched in Paleo-Hebrew script. They were found in burial caves that had once served high-status families, proof that before the valley became a garbage dump and a potter's quarry, it had been a place of honor. The scrolls revealed the dramatic fall in the valley's status across the centuries, from noble tombs to industrial waste site. Further excavations exposed the remains of the Roman 10th Legion's pottery workshop. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Legion took over the clay sources in the Hinnom Valley, producing bricks and roof tiles for the reconstruction of the city under Roman occupation. The same deposits that 1st century Jewish potters had mined to make oil lamps and storage jars were now feeding the kilns of the occupying army. The continuity of industrial use was unbroken, even as the political world above collapsed. Some archaeologists believe that one of the elaborate tomb complexes near Akeldama belonged to the high priestly family of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. If true, it means the very men who paid Judas 30 pieces of silver, who refused to take the coins back, who purchased the potter's field with the blood money. These men were eventually buried within sight of the field itself. Their bones rest in stone ossuaries, carved with rosettes and inscriptions, overlooking the valley where the man they paid met his end on the rocks below. Today, the white domes of the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. Onufrius crown the site. The monastery is staffed by nuns who tend citrus trees in the courtyard and maintain the chapel built over the ancient burial caves. It is a place of quiet prayer now, the smoke replaced by incense, the broken pottery replaced by icons. But beneath the whitewashed walls and the carefully swept stones, the earth remains the same. Depleted clay, azure, and the memory of a transaction that could not be undone. The story of Judas after the betrayal is not merely the collapse of one man's conscience. It is the story of how an entire city's systems processed contamination, ritual, financial, and moral, and disposed of it in the one place where disposal had been happening for centuries. The 30 pieces of silver moved through a sequence of rejections, paid from the sacred treasury, returned to the temple floor, declared too defiled to re-enter the Korban, converted into land outside the walls. The priests solved their legal problem by relocating the contamination entirely, purchasing a cemetery in the valley that already functioned as the city's dump. The transaction was clean, the taint was contained. The machinery of purity functioned exactly as designed. The potter's field itself was no accident of geography. It was a landscape already exhausted by industry, already marked by the smoke of the kilns and the shattered remains of failed vessels. The potters had extracted the clay, fired their wheels, discarded their wasters in heaps 2 meters thick, and moved on when the deposits ran dry. What remained was marginal earth, useful only for burying those who had no claim to the tombs of their fathers. Judas died in the valley that Jerusalem had been filling with its refuse since the time of the kings. The cliffs where he hanged himself overlooked the fires that burned continuously, the bones of unclean animals, the memory of child sacrifice and prophetic condemnation. His body fell onto rocks that had been shaped by centuries of industrial use and ritual rejection. The field earned its name twice, once from the silver, once from the blood, and both names pointed to the same reality. This was the place where the city dealt with what it could not redeem. For his family, the consequences were a different form of burial: denied mourning, excluded from the family tomb, erased from the kinship networks that determined survival in a world where identity was collective. The social machinery that governed honor and shame ground them down as thoroughly as the potter's wheel-shaped clay, and with the same indifference. This is history as it was actually lived, not abstractions, not theological debates, but coins with measurable silver content, legal rulings rooted in Deuteronomy, industrial workshops with rock-cut settling pools, and a municipal dump that became a metaphor for hell because everyone in Jerusalem could see the smoke rising from the valley below. The aftermath of the betrayal unfolded in the cold logistics of purity law, the economics of depleted land, and the topography of a valley that had been processing the city's waste, human and otherwise, for 600 years. If you're curious about the world Jesus lived in, told through the details that shaped daily survival, subscribe. The real human stories are in the clay, the coins, and the system that decided what could be redeemed and what had to be thrown into the fire.